This is Keys to the Shop, episode 280, a conversation with Jesse Hartman of the Coffee Podcast. Well, hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of Keys to the Shop, where we give you insights, inspiration, and the tools you need to grow as a coffee service professional. My name is Chris DeFirio. I'm your host for this show, and I so appreciate you taking the time to join me today. If you haven't subscribed, please do hit subscribe so you stay updated with all the episodes coming out at Keys to the Shop. Also, it would be great if you'd share these episodes with a friend, and if you love the show, leave a 5-star rating or review on iTunes. Thank you so much for doing that. Now, Keys to the Shop, on top of doing this podcast, offers consulting and coaching to help you thrive in your coffee business. Whether you're just getting started in the coffee industry and need an advisor to walk with you through the process of getting started on the right foot and laying the right foundations for your business, or you're established already as an operator, but you want to bring your operations to the next level. You want to improve the quality of your service and hospitality, improve your management, scale your business. There's a lot of ways that Keys to the Shop can come alongside you and help you, whether that's remotely over the phone or on site. If you're interested in learning more, I would love to hop on a call with you. To set up a free exploratory call, just email me at chris@keystotheshop.com. That's CHRIS at keystotheshop.com. And I look forward to hearing from you and hearing how I might be able to help you be successful in your cafe. Today's episode of Keys to the Shop is brought to you by Prima Coffee. Prima Coffee offers some of the best service for specialty coffee equipment in the world. Part of what makes them an amazing supplier of specialty equipment is not just because they're diligent to curate the best equipment, but also they work with their customers to make sure you're getting the right equipment for you. It's huge because equipment is such a big expense. You want to work with somebody who is in your corner, dedicated to your success. Now, if you're a Keys to the Shop listener, you can get 5% off your entire order over at prima-coffee.com/keys when you use the code KEYS5, that's KEYS, the number 5, at checkout. That's a huge offer. Use the code KEYS5 at checkout to get 5% off your entire order. And really, again, if you're in the market for commercial coffee equipment, you really need to reach out and partner with Prima Coffee. Today's episode is also brought to you by the Pacific Barista Series, the world's leader in plant-based performance beverages designed for baristas and with critical feedback every step of the way by some of the world's best baristas. That's why it performs so well on bar, stands up to the heat from the steaming process, creates amazing texture for latte art, and keeps the balance of the beverage focused on the coffee. There's no question about it. Sometimes more than 50% of your customer base is ordering a plant-based beverage, and you want to offer them the best experience. And I think you're going to get that in spades with the Barista Series. Go to their website, pacificfoodservice.com, to find out more information. Get these in your store and try it for yourselves. If you're looking for the best plant-based offerings for your customers, then I think the choice is clearly the Barista Series from Pacific. Okay, everybody. Well, today we are in for a treat. We are talking with Jesse Hartman of the Coffee Podcast. Jesse's podcast is a top 50 iTunes podcast in the food category, and that is really a great accomplishment. When you search coffee, you come up with the Coffee Podcast, number 1 out there. And it's no wonder, because Jesse does a really fantastic job exploring a wide range of topics on the show. And he's always been a curious person, and the Coffee Podcast is the result of years of asking experts questions on topics ranging from techniques on brewing better coffee to more nuanced conversations about coffee sustainability and coffee science and things like that. He is based in Austin, Texas. And when it comes to the Coffee Podcast, Jesse believes that even though coffee is a part of so many people's lives, it's really misunderstood worldwide. And that learning something new about coffee is a way to learn something new about ourselves and even the world. So the Coffee Podcast accomplishes this through conversations about coffee with experts, which ends up feeling like, sitting down at a cafe with old friends. And I think that's a great sentiment. In today's conversation, we're going to be talking to Jesse about the founding of the Coffee Podcast, his work in coffee before that, and then the development of how the podcast has evolved and what he's learned from all of these conversations he's had over the years on the Coffee Podcast, and then some insights on where we're going as an industry. And he and I get to talk about a good many topics that I think you're going to find really interesting in this conversation. So it's really fun to interview somebody who interviews people. And I'm glad to call Jesse a friend in the industry. And I hope that you really enjoy this conversation between two coffee podcasters. So without further ado, let's get right to it. Here now is my conversation with the host of the Coffee Podcast, Jesse Hartman. Well, Jesse Hartman, welcome to Keys to the Shop. How in the heck are you?
I'm good, and thanks for the invitation. It's an honor to be on Keys to the Shop.
I'm honored to have you on here, man.
Yeah.
Your podcast is when you search coffee in iTunes, the Coffee Podcast is the first thing that shows up. You're a top 50 podcast for food in iTunes, and you've been doing this quite a while. And I remember actually seeing you. And forgive me, but I'm blanking on your the first half of the Coffee Podcast. You had a co-host.
Yeah, Western Peterson.
Yeah. You and Wes were in your coffee podcast T-shirts doing an interview at Coffee Fest.
Was that in Austin?
It must have been a long time. It wasn't in Austin. It was somewhere else maybe in Texas, Dallas or something.
Oh yeah, no, it was Dallas.
I was like, who are these guys? Who is this coffee podcast? Not sure that I had the podcast at the time.
Yeah. What's actually funny about that day is Wes and I don't know, we had way too much coffee. We were just jittery and excited and super theatrical, and we somehow ended up that day on an infomercial for Ninja.
Oh.
And what's crazy is I had a friend who was in the hospital many years later, and he's watching the hospital TV and was like, he's like, man, they had me drugged up, but I think I saw you on TV.
Wow.
And it turned out, yeah, he saw us on the Ninja commercial. We never knew we actually made it into the commercial. Who knows what we were saying? But we signed one of those affidavits, and there you go.
There you go. We're going to have to look that up now. Yeah, for sure. Right after this call,
I kind of don't want to watch that. I don't know what we said. So
I mean, it might show up in the show notes. No promises.
Okay.
Well, I'm interested in starting from, because we're going to talk about a lot of big picture things in coffee, a little bit about also the podcast and your experiences with going through so many interviews and getting that big picture view of what people's perspectives are on coffee through the Coffee Podcast. But what brought you in particular into coffee, and at what point did you decide, hey, we need to start a coffee podcast?
Yeah. For me, starting at the beginning is helpful. My dad is a part of the story because we used to go every year to a Christmas story theatrical production in Jacksonville, where I'm from. Scrooge and all that. And that's where I had my first sip of coffee. It was like a dinner and a show kind of thing. It's pretty impressive. Probably hard to pull off during COVID now. But anyway, they would bring out coffee and it would smell incredible. And I was a kid. I'd be like, oh, that smells, it smells really good. And my dad would take those little creamer cups, right? And he would, he'd obviously pour it into his coffee first, but he would get a little bit. And then he handed it to me and kind of snuck it to me because I don't think I was supposed to be having coffee. According to maybe my mother or who knows, it just felt kind of sneaky. But that was my first. Oh man, I was little. I don't even know. I was tiny. Must have been, I don't know, 10 or younger, I would guess.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was my first experience with coffee. So it was a moment with my dad too, right? We had this moment of connection, and I can kind of now think of it very poetically of how that, anyway, I can go off into sort of artsy fartsy descriptions of how now I feel about that moment. But that was my first engagement with coffee. But my dad and I ended up doing this thing every weekend where we go to have breakfast. I'd have a cup of coffee when I was a little older, and coffee just became part of my regular routine. And at the time, I guess in high school, I was swinging on by the gas station for a Dunkin' Donuts cup of coffee, if you can believe it. And I would take that I would go before class, grab a cup of coffee, go to school. And that was me. Soon enough, we had a local Starbucks. And anyway, the point here is that coffee was a very regular part of my diet, I guess you could say. It felt like a routine for me, a kind of a ritual. And then when the Starbucks showed up in town, it was like the only barista-like thing we had, right? Because otherwise you're going to like McDonald's or in my town, it was McDonald's or Waffle House.
Oh, right.
Or the gas station Dunkin' Donuts. And so to have this Starbucks was, now we have this cultural place to go and as coffee's kind of known, or as the cafe's kind of known, Starbucks was my first experience with that cafe sort of environment. And, you show up and you're like, what are these words? And what is this thing? And it smells amazing in here. And all those kinds of things. That was my real, I think, moment of like, wow, there's like a whole cool thing about going to a coffee shop. So my buddy and I would start meeting at Starbucks. And all that to say, I eventually moved to Austin. And when I moved to Austin, the goal was to, I left Jacksonville. I got my associates in Jacksonville. And then I went to Austin thinking I was going to go back to school for computer science was the goal. And what ended up happening is I got whatever job I could find, because that's what you do when you first arrive to a place. You're just like, I just need a job. I worked a retail job, and I regulared a Starbucks. And the owner there, he was really friendly, or not the owner, sorry, the store manager was, he just liked me. And one day he was like, hey, you seem like a nice guy and very personable. And would you like to work here? And I was like, heck yeah. It was kind of a dream to work at a coffee shop, right? For me. And what happened is simultaneously, as I'm stepping into the Starbucks world, the world of being, a Starbucks employee slash barista, I'm stepping into the world of specialty. And this happens almost in parallel because I had a roommate who had a mocha pot. And that mocha pot was the beginning of this fascination with making coffee at home and sort of experimenting. And, hey, I can kind of make this cappuccino thing at home, right?
Yeah.
And so this is all happening in parallel. And simultaneously, my buddy, he's like, you got to go over to this shop in town. They have the best cup of coffee you've ever seen, okay? And I'm in Austin, Texas. So this place is Houndstooth. And anyway, so I go with my buddy, my other roommate, Johan. We both go. We're like, hey, let's just go hang out at this coffee shop. Anyway, I don't know what I ordered. I don't know what he ordered, but we both ordered coffees. I think some kind of filter brew coffee. And we both hated our coffees. Hated them.
Oh, no.
Yeah. And it was like, what was Justin talking about? This is like, nah. And, we're trying to like drink it black because we feel the pressure of drinking it black in the space because it's a different environment. And anyway, so I came out of that situation basically thinking like, I don't get it. Right? I don't get it. And soon after that, I was still working at my one retail job. I was working 3 jobs at this point. It was kind of not a great memory. And I remember this one day, I was like, okay, I'm going to go to Houndstooth. And I ordered an El Salvadoran Americano. And I was on my way to work. And I took a sip of that coffee. And it blew my mind. Absolutely just, it blew the lid off of what I thought about coffee. Right?
Nice.
And it was that coffee that later that day, it was actually storming in Austin. It was raining. So I walked in the rain to get another cup of that coffee. It was like, because I had to go back and get it. So that was sort of my transition into, wow, what is this specialty coffee stuff? Because, it's mind blowing.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
So I had this very sort of romantic experience with that cup of coffee. And that cup of coffee brought me to the place of becoming obsessive about how do I make my coffee taste like this all the time. And I think when I was beginning, I just had this idea of I can just make coffee taste better. But I soon learned the coffee itself plays a major role, right, in how good the coffee is. And then I learned, it's also the water, and it's also how well is my grinder grinding, and the trajectory was set. And then I started having this friction at the Starbucks I was working at with my manager because I became obsessed with quality and obsessed with handing out a drink that tasted like that coffee I had at Houndstooth. Right.
Right. You were becoming annoying.
Yeah, I was becoming very annoying. and my manager let me know. He pulled me into the office and he's like, Jesse, what are you doing? You can't steam milk that slow. You can't, I was being meticulous. I was like, I want to make sure there's exactly the right amount of syrup in this thing. And I want to make, because that's the kind of person I am. I'm very much like, I want this thing. I want to see the customer's life be impacted when they take a sip. Like I want to like kind of from afar, just be like, okay, they're going to take that first sip and their life, or they're going to light up or something. Like I love that moment.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to have that at Starbucks with something like an El Salvadorian coffee that was a specialty coffee, which is impossible in that context. Right. So I became very annoying. I hopped around to a few other coffee jobs. I hit another coffee job in town where it was like, oh, this is a third wave shop, but it wasn't really. It was still second wave, and I was still annoying there because I was like, hey, let's change some systems, right? Let's like make this coffee better, and they weren't about it. And then I hopped over to this local restaurant where they were trying to launch a specialty coffee program, but it was kind of a stretch of a goal for them. That didn't work out, and I finally landed a specialty coffee job in Austin at a place called Seventh Flag Coffee, where all my joys and loves of specialty coffee were fed and brought to full life. And it was from there I went on to manage and open a cafe called Manana downtown South Congress Hotel. And then I was hired soon after that for another retail coffee shop in Austin as a retail operations manager. And so I kind of, I was stepping into more and more responsible roles with more and more responsibility. And in that time frame, when I was opening Manana, so the coffee shop, when I was the GM over there, opening that shop is when the podcast started. And so that's how I got to where I got to.
That is such a good story because it kind of, everybody can relate to the romantic notion of that revelation you had. And then I think you were subconsciously trying to get every customer to have that romantic aha moment, to use an overused phrase. But, the life-changing moment that you're talking about. And then you work in coffee for a while and you realize like, okay, that's like there's a lower percentage of that happens on a daily basis, but it's maybe a slower process to that life change. But it seems appropriate that after all that experience, you personally and then in your professional career, you start a coffee podcast because at this point, you have changed as a professional. You're not just like the annoying, Starbucks barista that is just questioning all things Starbucks. Or you've matured, right, through these responsibilities. We could do a whole show on things that you learned along your career path. But I think a lot of that probably shows in the podcast itself. And so when you started the podcast, what was the goal and how did you execute those ideas? And then to add more complexity to the question, what did you recognize as being critical from your experience that let the podcast be a success?
Yeah. I got to say, the podcast went through a very similar series of change as I did early with coffee. But I'll start with, the podcast was born out of Wes and I are like brothers. And before that, we were just getting to know each other before the podcast. We just got along really well. And every time we got together, we would just talk about coffee. He was working for, I think when we met, he was working at a coffee shop, but soon after that, he was working for a coffee trader. And so, we would just trade stories and talk. And one day we were at a pizza joint in Austin, and we were just sitting there chatting. And I think we had mentioned a podcast we listened to too, that kind of thing. And we're like, wait, what if we did a podcast? What if we sat down and talked about, you think people would even care? And Wes had built up his Instagram to be this cool photography coffee Instagram. I mean, it was slick looking. And I think he built some following there. And that was kind of our launch point. We're like, hey, let's like tell Wes's followers we're going to do this podcast, because he had this cool coffee photography Instagram. And that's how it started. The question of what were the critical moments of it becoming successful, I think part of that is the fact that the podcast itself kind of takes on that, it personifies, in a sense, the experience of starting from little knowledge to growing in knowledge. So that maturity of I mean, our first episodes were very, even down to quality, is like there's maturity and quality. But those first episodes are like, hey, welcome to the Coffee Podcast, you know, and they're very just they very much sound like a first podcast episode from people who don't have a lot of money to throw into it. That we're just like doing this thing, and we're just talking about things we care about. And soon enough, we start bringing in articles from Daily Coffee News. Nick Brown was writing some really cool stuff. We were covering a lot of, or kind of reiterating stuff he was talking about, and kind of ideating, and there was a lot of conjecture. And so this just chit chat kind of stuff. But we were also talking about like, hey, how can you just like practically brew better coffee at home? And then we got into, well, what are some cool coffee things going on? So Third Wave Water came onto the show, and I mean, this was 2000, and I think that must have been 2016 or something like that. So this is like, we're just covering everything coffee we can think of. And I think a critical moment in the podcast was, and quite frankly, a very embarrassing moment, was we tried to cover, I think it was genetics, coffee genetics. Okay. And it involved a paper, I believe, from World Coffee Research. Mm-hmm. And and we tried to talk about something way out of our league. And we got a call out from WCR. We got like an email, and it was a very unhappy email about that episode, and how like they appreciated that we wanted to talk about it, but how we didn't do it a good service because we are not geneticists. And it wasn't a harsh email. It was just it was like a whoa, like kind of like a wake up call. Like you're a bit out of your depth here, right? And that was embarrassing. But it wasn't just embarrassing. It was a lesson. It was a lesson in, okay, it's fine to chit chat. It's fine to say, hey, what if this? What if that? But when we start to say stuff, when we start to like make very clear statements about things, we need to make sure that we know what we're actually saying, what we're talking about. And so this responsibility of like, careful what you say, just fell on us like a heavy weight. And from that point on, it was like, how can we fix that? And the way that we fixed that was, oh, why are we talking about this? Let's bring these people on the show, right? And ask them and learn from them. And that became a major turning point. That's what's made the podcast successful. It's not the chit chat necessarily, but the switching gears from, yes, there was a lot of value in the early days of saying, hey, let's just get excited about making good coffee at home. Let's talk about cool coffee gear. And I think a lot of people got engaged in that way, but they were also in the train, right? When it went up the mountain and started talking about things like sustainability or the coffee price crisis. And I believe that maturity, or I hope that maturity is happening, not just for me as it continues to happen, but also for the listeners.
Well put. Yeah. And, learning from your mistakes is obviously the greatest way to grow. And to get called out like that, for sure, it seems like, oh gosh, my heart would be in my throat or on the floor. But good on you all for correcting that and realizing that I think a lot of people do with platforms is that there are a lot of responsibilities that come with that to make sure that what you're saying is at least verifiable and is the best information as far as it depends on you, right? In your collection of episodes over the years, there is a certain advantage that you have now, as somebody who has heard a lot, looked into a lot, talked about a lot, and that is sort of the patterns that emerge and watching trends come and go. As you interviewed people and talked about topics, what kinds of revelations or takeaways did you receive yourself that you said, oh man, like this is a bigger issue than I thought it was.
Yeah.
And I could have only have gotten there by doing as many interviews as we have done.
I'm glad you've asked that. It makes me try and run through the catalog of things we've talked about. And I don't know if this is what's coming to mind because it's just been the thing that's been most on my mind, or because this has been building up for 5 years. One of the first interviews we had was about sustainability. Okay. And I remember that episode. I was with Kim Lena Ionescu. I think she was the director of sustainability. I might have got that title wrong at the time at the SEA. That conversation opened the floodgates of what is going on in coffee for me. I think that conversation tied to, there were some articles, I want to say, that we talked about from Bloomberg, maybe even from Nick Brown at Daily Coffee News, about El Salvador. And they were going through some really tough stuff back then. And that's also where the development of, we had this concept of all the hands in coffee. So we really shifted the conversation majorly into, from, cafe trader talk, kind of fun jitter jabber stuff, to let's talk about more like what's happening at Origin. And let's talk more about like how all this connects. And so that idea of sustainability, it's a very difficult topic to wrap your brain around in some sense, but in other senses, it's kind of simple, right? It's just like, hey, if we keep doing coffee the way we've been doing it, it's not going to last, right? That's like the simple way to talk about it. But there's a lot of really nuanced and complex concepts built into that. I think for me, the thing that I've seen over 5 years of doing this is I'm going to kind of ideate as I talk, because I don't have it in a little, fancy wrapped thing to say. I feel like it's kind of a little still scattered in my brain. But the idea is that coffee as a crop has been, like, the history of coffee has played a major role in what we ended up with today. And I think part of changing the systems that need to change have to be grounded in understanding how those systems were built in the first place. And what we're looking at is a very messed up system, I think, where coffee was built on very cheap land, sometimes taken from people. If you even think of South America, where land was, I think they called it the privatization of land, which was kind of code for, hey, let's take land from the natives, right? Land that they've had for who knows how long, that kind of stuff, but also really cheap labor. So another example is in South America, taking land from these people and then saying, hey, you need to work the land that we've taken from you. And that's just one example of the horrific injustices that have happened in coffee over the last few centuries, right? And so we're looking at this system. Why is coffee so cheap? Why does the consumer just feel so fine about coffee being so cheap for the most part? And that is the thing that bothers me the most, that's on my mind the most, is like, where's this thing going? If we keep just talking about sustainability over here and then we're talking about this over there, and I feel we're really disjointed as an industry in what we're actually communicating, to each other, maybe to the consumer. I don't feel like we're all on the same page. And when I say that, I mean I'm talking about the interconnectivity of all of the parts of the coffee value chain. That's my perspective. I know that when we're in specialty coffee, we feel like, oh, we are always talking about sustainability. I just don't feel that we're moving at the same rate or moment that we should. I think that conversations don't do anything if there's no action. And I am concerned if we as an industry, and I'm not talking about the consumer, I'm talking about everybody up to the consumer, if we don't, as an industry, communicate a very clear and solid message to the consumer, I think we're in trouble.
Right.
And
yeah,
I don't know what that message needs to be, but I think we all need to be on the same page. And I'm concerned that we're not. I think we sound like online when we're just talking in our specialty coffee communities, it sounds like we're on the same page, but like I'm talking the entire coffee sector.
Well, you mentioned it earlier when you said I'm going to ideate as I talk, and I think that as an industry, what you're describing is a large-scale ideation process where people are talking about it, and in the talking about it, sometimes there's a satisfaction that, wow, at least we're talking about it. Really cool.
Yeah.
Now, and then we have sort of the almost like the privatization of the conversation. In a sense, like we have, we created an industry around talking about something.
Yeah.
And
That's
so the question becomes like what you're asking, well, like how do we go from talking about it, which from a podcaster's perspective isn't like, well, this is what podcasts do is we talk about things. The danger is like, here's a new episode that you should listen to about sustainability. And then what are the actions you take after that? I suppose it's a danger and an asset because realistic or not realistically, but ideally you would have a distilled and curated list of topics that you're going to be talking about. So action is a little bit more likely to happen afterwards. But I mean, how do you manage the promotion of ideas around sustainability and the call to action that are inherently needed to make good on what's being talked about? From your perspective, I mean, like how do you manage that balance?
How do I manage like what to talk about? You know, this is a great question because the most recent episode I did was a bit out of the normal genre of Jesse Coffee podcasting. It was I had Cesaro, who's a WWE superstar, so it's World Wrestling Entertainment for those of you not familiar with that world, and it's very off the path for me, and I actually debated. I was like, is this something I should even do? Because like we got coffee price problems, you know, and we got you know, there's some serious stuff going down. There's some deforestation conversations that haven't really even happened. That Dr. Aaron Davis brought up, like that coffee is, he believes is one of the primary contributors to deforestation in many regions. And like, there's all these other conversations that people need to know about these things. But I went and did an episode that I called Sips with Celebrities, Cesaro, and, you know, we goofed off and talked about cortados, and it was fun, and it was a good time. But I'm conflicted when I do stuff like that because I'm like, but there's these other very serious things that we need to talk about. So that balance for me, I guess I kind of run off of my conscience, if that even is a thing I can do. Is it's just kind of like I'll bounce it off my wife and I'll say, hey, this is the conflict I have in my heart about doing this thing. And she's great. She's a great counselor in general. So I'm just like, whatever she normally says, I'm like, oh man, why didn't I think of that? And so she's kind of my gauge a lot of the time on, hey, should I or should I not do this? And I also will poll my audience and I'll say, hey, like I did for this, I pulled my audience, hey, should I do this kind of content or not? And I had some people who sounded adamant and said, no, don't do that. And then I went with the majority rule. So I took some counsel from one of my most trusted partners, and then I polled my audience. And so I kind of, I do a mix of counsel, I guess. I check my heart. I say, hey, how do I feel about this? If I feel conflicted, let me talk to my listeners. Let me talk to my wife. And sometimes I'll go outside of that and I'll ask some other people that I trust. And that's how I make decisions.
Yeah, that sounds great. I mean, getting counsel is always recommended, right? And as you're talking, I'm thinking about, my own process, and then I'm thinking about coffee shop experiences and also your story and how you came into coffee and what you did not do and I don't think very many people do this when they fall in love, quote unquote, with coffee, is they don't listen to a podcast about deforestation and then fall in love with coffee.
Yeah,
right?
they do, don't they?
So this is like the graduate. I mean, maybe there's somebody out there, but the graduate level of coffee content in a sense, like there's this balance of, who knows what kind of attraction consumers of podcasts you could have attracted by having this guy on your show. In the same way that not everything the manager talks about with the staff is going to be like dead serious. In a cafe, there has to be like a mix of culture. It's not all serious all the time. Mm-hmm. But it seems like you need a balance where it's not just all like life and death stuff in the show to attract more people to that. And then when they're there, obviously they're going to say, well, what else does Jesse talk about? Here you have privatization of land and the Coffee Science series, which congratulations on that. Really great series.
Thank you.
Yeah, I like that I actually like that you did that, and that you got counsel to do it first. And moving from that, I want to talk about when you attack something like, well, the way that you do the show, for example, now has changed, and you're deep diving into topics rather than bouncing around from topic to topic. Tell me more about that.
Yeah. So the idea, there were a lot of reasons actually for, I'm going to get really transparent here. There were a lot of reasons for changing the way I started delivering content. One of the actual primary reasons, the way that I changed from releasing weekly to releasing serial kind of stuff, was because I got married in 2017. And when I was, around that time, Wes was transitioning out of the podcast. He was getting ready to join the Marines. But around that time, I was newly married. It was a whole different kind of way of living for me. And I was working a full-time job that was really intense. And I was coming home and doing the podcast like every single night. So if you can imagine having a partner who you'd rarely see, who's off working, comes home, works more, and you never see them. That's not good for a marriage, okay? And so that's just some general advice. Don't do that. I was put in this position where Allie and I sat down and we're like, do we need to get rid of the podcast? Because it's getting in the way of our marriage. It was starting to just not be a healthy thing for us, especially that early on. And so I kind of came to terms with it. I was like, I had a contract at the time with a sponsor, and I was like, man, like I was even thinking like, am I going to have to do something about this contract? And all that to say, we got to the end of the year, and through lots of discussion and circumstances, we were able to decide, hey, let's not stop the podcast. We feel like that conversation needs to happen. Allie's a firm believer, has always been so supportive. And so we came up with the idea, hey, let's start doing serial content because I think that's more structured anyway, and let's do that. And so that's how that happened, frankly. It gives me a season of rest, because, I mean, I don't know if listeners of Keys to the Shop may or may not have heard the Coffee Podcast, or may or may not understand that this is not my full-time gig. This is a very, very serious hobby of mine, is the podcast. And so, to be a professional podcaster, I mean, Chris, you know this, it takes everything. You have to be extremely focused. You can't be, your heart cannot be split between, a full-time gig and a coffee podcast, to do something like that full-time. It can't be. And so it gave me the space I needed to breathe and to ideate and it takes me about a year to produce a series, at least a year, because I'm one person and, it just takes a long time.
Right.
So that's how I came to release in series. And I wanted to do series before, but this was kind of a nice way to get there, I guess. Some resolution that came from some hard times, right? And so that decision came out of all of that.
Well, that's a good decision, it seems. I think the subject matter that you have the coffee podcast is evolved to focus on is deserving of a series more so than other topics. Any topic, I guess, could be a series, really, but some of the more serious conversations, of course, and like coffee science or sustainability as an example, though definitely benefit from that in-depth approach to things. And so it seems like it's worked out both ways. And so, and I can definitely attest to that. It takes a lot. It really does. But there is a lot out there to consume, and that's part of the issue that we have as an industry is there's so many conversations happening. It's hard to know what to pay attention to. Right. Now, it's been how many years? It's been for you 5-6 years.
Yeah, since 2015.
Yeah.
So this year it'll be 6 years. Yeah.
6 years. So from all that you have heard and investigated, and now looking to the future, if we can put on our future gazing hats or whatever, how do you see the industry evolving? What are the next phases of the industry that you kind of see are already underway and that we could pretty much expect are going to be a part of our future?
The only thing I can feel relatively sure about the future in coffee at this point, I think, is the idea that we will see more consolidation. And when I say that, I mean, I think that more things like we saw where JAB was buying up a bunch of specialty / coffee things, right? I think that kind of stuff is going to happen more. I think it's already kind of been happening. I think it will be more aggressive because of COVID. I think companies will be in positions where they're potentially more willing to sell. And I expect that to happen. And I expect it to happen in ways like we've seen it as well, where there are brands and companies that you just don't know have a higher investor or a big company kind of behind them. And I'm not demonizing that kind of stuff. I'm just saying I'm expecting to see that more. I've always been concerned about the future of coffee for generational families of growers. I know we've been tooting the horn in the specialty coffee sector for a while that the younger generation doesn't want to do it. And my response to that is, can you blame them?
Right.
And I think I used to kind of ignorantly be like, oh, this is a horrible problem. And it is, right, for the sector. But like, if I was a young, a son or daughter of a coffee producer, and I saw, hey, it's a really volatile crop and there's a lot of struggle here, and the city's offering different things for me, like, what would I do? How are we going to address those kinds of things? Anyway, all that to say, there are the issues of things like deforestation that I haven't even opened the can on for myself. But that idea of consolidation, of companies merging or the sector itself becoming more homogenous, I think is probably going to happen. Also, one more thing that I think will happen that's already kind of on its way is this idea of selling lower grade specialty coffee as specialty coffee. And I forget what the points are off the top of my head, but there's like 83, I think. What's the starting point for specialty?
I believe it's 83.
Yeah, something like that. I think we're going to see a lot more 83ers on the market soon, from brands that we maybe didn't expect it from. And those are probably a few things. I'm no James Hartman. I know he makes some really great projections, and he releases those every year. And it's always fascinating to watch those.
Right. I mean, you've also seen a lot in your conversations, and those are I feel like those predictions and what you've said is you can look out into the industry and see that happening, and it just doesn't show any signs of slowing down for sure. Some of them are good, and some of them are not so good.
Yeah.
And it depends on your perspective too, in terms of sustainability and consolidation, because sometimes
Right.
that's what will keep a bunch of smallholder farmers together is, collectively,
Yeah.
just getting together, call it a cooperative, call it consolidation.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah. I think the idea of a cooperative is a great idea for smallholder farms, unless they can somehow miraculously engage in the market by themselves.
Right. Right.
That just seems like a very difficult thing to do. And any smallholder producer doing that, I mean, kudos to them. That's a pretty incredible feat. The thing that we didn't see was happening, that ended up happening, I think, or was accelerated with COVID, is all the home brewers, right? The season of staying at home has, I would postulate that a lot of home espresso machines were sold in the last year and a half or 2 years, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, even just look at James Hoffman's YouTube channel, just exploding. And I think a lot of people are starting to bring the cafe experience home. I kind of asked the same question that I asked for movie theaters about this one. Like, what is going to happen? Is this going to have any negative effect on cafes? I really hope not.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. We've talked about it a couple times on the show, but I feel like your experience in playing around with that mocha pot that your friend had as an example of how even and I think this about podcasts too, because if I was just having a conversation about a topic with, a few thousand people about a subject, I mean, there'd be a lot of back and forth. We wouldn't really get to you wouldn't really be able to dwell on a thought long enough to form an opinion about it, because you'd be listening to a bunch of other voices and stuff. But when you're by yourself with a coffee, when you're experimenting at home, you give yourself a lot of room to sort of get into it on your own terms. And that drives sort of this idea that I am a coffee aficionado or geek or now professional / owner / podcaster, whatever your trajectory is. But it does seem like it might be okay, I don't need to go to the shop more, but maybe it will actually be better for shops, because it will create a little bit more buy-in, because people don't have to be told what to think. They'll just discover what they think.
Yeah. There's definitely that. I know for me, it turned into around that time in my life, going to the local coffee shop and being asking the baristas, hey, what kinds of ratios are you using for things like your Clever, or your flash brew that you do, or your iced coffee that you do? And that was also a place that I would go and learn. Now, I know since then, there's so much YouTube content out there now. That's a bit different than when I was first getting into it, because I guess maybe now I might go to YouTube.
The good work of people on various platforms is going to be more and more to curate the information so that we know what to focus on. So it presents new challenges, just like the topic of sustainability could be talked about ad nauseum, and in a lot of ways maybe has been. But as I said to people on the podcast before, hey, if you're just listening to each and every episode because it's really you're really into it, but you're not actually doing anything about what you hear, then maybe you should take a break, and go do some of that stuff, so that you're not taking 2 steps forward and 1 step back. But this, but that too. There's we have a lot of content, and I feel that that's somewhat of a double-edged sword when it says hey, I have a coffee podcast, listen, subscribe, so you never miss an episode and all that stuff. But then, what is it what's the result of all of that communication? If it's not action, then what is it we're doing? Do we really love the sound of our own voice? I mean, I'll put my hand up and say, no, I don't. I have hundreds of recordings of me being keys to the shop, and stopping. This is stupid.
Yep.
But anyway, just some random thoughts on my end there about platforms and content, calls to action, and all that.
It's the future feels to me less, or it feels harder to predict what's going to happen tomorrow. I think because COVID, at least for my part of the world, sort of blindsided our culture. And I think that just makes predicting, like, you're just less certain about things that you might have just like flippantly been like, I think this is what's happening next. So it's knocked a little bit of certainty out of the sales. That's not a saying, but it could be maybe.
Yeah, that's the thing, that we don't have a lot of certainty, but I think lack of certainty breeds a lot more discipline. So maybe that will spur us on to action a little bit more.
Yeah.
And certainly, I've said, I'm not sure how true this is, but the coffee retail sector has definitely experienced just a very minor fraction of what it's like to be a coffee farmer in the uncertainty category. The closures that we've been seeing, the volatility and all that other stuff. I hope that this time has bred more empathy in retail. If this is even half of what it's like or less of what it's like to be a farmer, then we truly do need to take action.
The idea of slowing down, which for sure COVID did, slowed the whole world down, is I run into the challenge myself, or the temptation myself when I'm alone to distract myself because I don't want to think about, stuff going on. And I think COVID has slowed the world down, and it would be really great if out of that comes a more well-produced, actionable kind of thing to do for the coffee sector. A lot of things came out during COVID that needed to be talked about, right? And the culture either received or did not receive it, I guess, depending on where you are or who you are. And the idea of slowing down is, I think, scary for a lot of people, but here we are. We're slowed down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, it's like when you're an owner of a coffee bar and you go away for 2 or 3 days for the first time and you realize that the place didn't burn down.
Yeah.
And you realize by slowing down a little bit that the industry has a particular resilience to it. And maybe you weren't slowing down long enough to actually have, substantial enough ideas that they gain traction, but now realizing that, we have this opportunity, let's use it. This is time for us to reevaluate, a forced reevaluation, slowing the momentum. Some introspection is really, really critical for sure. As we wrap up here, I think I have just a couple more questions for you. And one of them is, as the audience of Keys to the Shop is largely retail focused. And that question is about action, really. Retailers want to represent the work of the value chain to the consumer, and also by that token to their baristas. What would you say to a retailer who wants to be conscientious of what's going on in the value chain, in the coffee industry, to effectively communicate and represent the work of all of the people that is in the hopper, in the cup?
Yeah.
What kind of things would you tell them?
This is a great question. I would say if you are trying to accomplish a retail model that reflects trying to communicate the value in the cup from seed to cup, and you could argue from before seed to cup, because seed lots and stuff. I think one of your crucial missions is to clearly and honestly communicate what's going on. And I say clearly because I think that a lot of what happens before the coffee is brewed for the consumer is still a mystery. And I think to communicate it clearly means to say, to educate them in a non-intrusive way. Maybe it's just part of your regular talking points when you talk to a consumer. Most of stuff's gone online. So, when people are buying coffee, including that snippet about how the coffee has gone from many hands, I think is helpful. When people see the idea of hands crossing, there's that human element, I think that is just naturally communicated. And the reason I said honestly, I think is because there's dishonesty happening in our sector. There's this idea of greenwashing. There's a lot of just misinformation still just flopping around about where a coffee came from or how much was paid for that coffee. And some of it is flat out lies, and some of it is just not doing the work of making sure you're doing your part and making sure you're part of a sustainable value chain. And so I would say, I know you're tired. I'm sure from COVID you're exhausted. I'm sure some of you are really struggling to keep the doors open still. And so I know that this is not an easy task, especially now. But I think that the challenge and the honorable thing to do is to do a little more legwork to communicate what's going on behind the scenes. Because the consumer, for the most part, doesn't know unless they're going to do the work for themselves. And I don't think it makes sense to make the consumer do the work for themselves.
Right.
At least not on this side of the conversation. I think on the other side of the conversation, I would say to consumers, if you really care about this stuff, before you buy a cup of coffee, like ask them, hey, where did you buy this? And are you comfortable sharing how much you paid for it per pound? Because that's some really sensitive information, right?
Sure. Yeah.
And we toss it around like, oh, how much did you pay for coffee? But it was brought to my attention in the recent series, like, especially when we're asking producers, like, hey, what's your cost of production? And all, it's like, whoa, you're really getting into the deep with producers in ways that maybe they don't want you to.
Clear, honest communication about the story of coffee, all the, what they say, warts and all, right? The industry itself. And no, you're not trying to just throw shade on the industry necessarily.
No, not at all. That'd be counterproductive.
But the point is that you want people to have a realistic perspective on what they're representing, and you can do the education on your end as a retailer. I 100% agree with you that I don't think we should put it on customers to look up the information for themselves and hold us accountable. I mean, we are literally professionals in this industry, and it is firmly in our place to take that mantle and use it for research, development, education, communication, all that stuff. And so I love that advice is just absolutely relevant. I would encourage everybody to just take you up on that for sure. And one way to do that is to subscribe to your show and listen to the Coffee Podcast.
Thanks. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, because again, these series are really fantastic. You have a great catalog of episodes, topics, and guests. And so, in my last question to you, I suppose, and this has really been great, Jesse. So thank you so much for being on the show.
Thanks for having me. It's an honor. Truly.
Yeah. I mean, what is next for the Coffee Podcast? Are there more wrestlers that are going to go on the show? Are we getting into the X Games or what's going on?
Yeah. Okay, let me say first, it's a little bit of a qualifier. I know I just threw out a challenge to do more legwork, and I'm not ignorant of the fact that costs money, actually. Your time is a resource, and a lot of the time that resource is attached to money, right? It costs you, when you spend time, I mean, the most easy case is as an hourly employee, when you spend time, that costs money. So I am not ignorant of that fact, and I just want to make that clear. I'm not just like, Hail Mary, throw a dream idea out there. I understand that.
Sure. You're not like hashtag do better.
Yeah, I'm not hashtag do better stuff. I realize that costs you and you're already struggling. And it's easy for me to throw that charge. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. Okay. What's next for the Coffee Podcast? There is a series that is, and it's very, very, it's not even been, the seed's been planted, so to speak, but I would say I have not poured any water on it kind of thing. I haven't, it's just, I literally just put it in the ground. So I can't talk about that one.
Okay.
Primarily because I don't want to overpromise. I want to deliver what I say I'm going to deliver, but ideally, it would be my biggest series I've done so far, right? Ideally, that's what it is. But I'm going to be doing some spotlight content. Some of the topics that are really interesting to me as of late have to do with some of the work that we've seen in coffee genetics, some of the work that we've seen happening, or rather, happening in coffee history. There's still some topics to cover there. There's probably always topics there. And so this idea also of sips with celebrities, which is kind of, a thing I'm sort of uncomfortable with doing, but also I see the value in doing, is something I'm going to try and pursue a little more. So we'll see what happens with those things. I kind of have these categories of these categories of content. So I have like spotlight material, which is wherein I just have a one-off topic that I'm covering. And then I have something that we called Coffeespeak, which is where I have members of the actual coffee community who come up and they talk about different topics. I don't have any of those planned yet. And then I have Sips with Celebrities is the new one. And then I have my serial content, which I can't talk about.
Nice.
It's just that it's going to be big.
I love it. Yeah, very mysterious.
Yeah. Yes, very.
Well, that sounds really intriguing, and I'm glad for all of the categories and all of your content. And again, really glad to have you on the show. Where can we learn more? Your website, social, and all that?
Yeah, you could, if you go to the website, you can sign up for the newsletter. I call it my brews letter. That sounds, I'm sure that's very original.
It sounds like news. That's the twist.
Yeah. That is the twist. Yeah, so that's you can go and sign up there. I don't release a newsletter as often as I would like, but when I do, I try to include discounts. Also some insider information about what's next. So I try and announce things there before I announce it anywhere else. So if you are kind of on the edge of your seat about, what's next, that'd be a good place to go get it. And then I'm always happy to hear from listeners about what they think about the content or questions they have. But yeah, let me say too, Chris, you've been doing your podcast for a long time. How many years you've been at it?
It's going to be 5.
Yeah.
Pretty shortly.
Yeah. And I know a lot of people are benefiting from your podcast, especially through the COVID situation. And so, I always, I travel around, or before COVID I did, and I would travel around and I'd go to coffee shops and I would always, punt this question out there. Hey, do you know any good coffee podcasts? Because I'm trying to hey, what are y'all listening to?
Yeah.
And I would hear Keys to the Shop come up so much. And it was cool because I was like, when I was opening coffee shops, as a general manager or the retail operations manager, the content that I had available to me was not as robust as what you have to offer at Keys to the Shop. There's so many great topics there, and so I would say, keep on listening to Chris's podcast as well. It's kind of my input there, and there's a lot to gain. And it's something I wish I had when I was doing coffee shops.
Nice. That's nice of you to say. I appreciate that, Jesse. So definitely people should check you out on those on the website, social, and sign up for the Brews letter, which would be a great MMA newsletter too, by the way. Anyway, Jesse, again, thank you so much. It's really been great.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks for having me.
Well, if there's one thing I hope that we walk away from this conversation with today, it's that conversation itself is a very useful tool in hashing out what needs to happen in terms of next actions for the industry. And I also love the idea that, as retailers, we can do the work of communicating where coffee is honestly with our staff and with consumers. And I think I could speak for all of us that love coffee, that love this industry, is that our love for this industry and for this beverage is still what motivates us today to seek change and betterment across all of the parts of the value chain. And you get to see all those parts of the value chain represented in the Coffee Podcast. And so a big thank you to Jesse for joining me on the show. I would recommend you go subscribe to the Coffee Podcast. wherever you like to listen to podcasts. It's just The Coffee Podcast. You can also go to thecoffeepodcast.com and be sure to follow The Coffee Podcast on Instagram. That's just at The Coffee Podcast. Now, I want to draw your attention to something happening this year that I'm so excited about, and that is Coffee Fest. For over 25 years, Coffee Fest trade shows have been the most valuable asset to the retail coffee community, hands down. I've been heavily involved in Coffee Fest since 2004, talking to what now is probably thousands of people. One thing I can tell you about Coffee Fest is that the content is hyper relevant. It is based on extremely detailed feedback that Coffee Fest gets from its attendees every year, so it speaks to the issues that you're having as a coffee retailer like nothing else. If you go to coffeefest.com, you can find out where the shows are happening this year. We're going to San Antonio, Atlanta, Anaheim, and Portland for live shows in 2021. I will be at all of these shows, and I hope to see you at those events. Coffee Fest is also launching its first online learning platform called Coffee Fest 365. You can learn more about that over at coffeefest.com as well. So if you want to grow, learn, be equipped, if you want your team to learn, grow, and be equipped, then I highly encourage you to go to coffeefest.com, register for one of these shows. It is really fun to be with like-minded people, growing our capacity to serve great coffee. Again, go to the website to register, coffeefest.com. So if you have any questions, comments, or feedback for me about this episode or anything else that we put out, the Keys to the Shop, then feel free to email me, chris@keystotheshop.com. It's also where you can contact me to find out more about Keys to the Shop Consulting. That's chris@keystotheshop.com. And with that, that is the end of our episode today. Thank you so much again for joining me and for listening to the show. I appreciate all of you, and I hope you have a wonderful day. And as always, I hope that this episode has truly given you keys to the shop.